Today is August 5th. It's the 218th day of the year, and this is the On This Day podcast. On this day in 1861, Congress passes the Revenue Act of 1861, the first income tax imposed on American citizens, levied in order to pay for the Civil War. The first income tax is a flat tax, 3% on all annual incomes over $800. If you compare the historical value of wages of the average worker, $800 in 1861 would be about $150,000 in today's dollars. The flat tax passed on this day is revised into a progressive tax structure the following year in 1862, with incomes over $600 taxed at 3% and incomes over $10,000 taxed at 5%. And starting what has become a great tradition in the United States, the tax code is revised yet again in 1864, at that point to 5% tax on incomes over $600, 7.5% over $5,000, and 10% on incomes over $10,000. Using the same labor earnings comparison, that $10,000 that's taxed at 10%, that's equivalent to about $1.7 million today. These historical comparisons, though, should be taken with a big grain of salt. Abraham Lincoln's annual salary as president when he's signing all of these tax bills is $25,000, or $4.4 million today. Sure, he lives in the White House, but the first federal staffer only started at the White House 4 years earlier in 1857. The president has to pay most of his expenses out of his own pocket, and he certainly doesn't have all the trappings of a king that the modern president has. Kind of think I'd rather go back to paying the president $4 million a year and let them pay their own expenses, but I digress. The first federal income tax passed by Congress on this day in 1861, and its revisions of 1862 and 1864 are allowed to expire in 1873. It's only meant to be a temporary tax, and that's what the voting public are led to believe. And by 1873, Congress is flirting with deficit spending, so the income tax legislation is allowed to expire as a way to avoid temptation. Another flat tax is tried in 1894, but the Supreme Court rules it unconstitutional because the tax is not apportioned according to the population of each state. So Congress amends the Constitution, and the 16th Amendment is ratified by the states in 1913, allowing Congress to levy an income tax without apportioning it among the states or basing it on the U.S. Census. And that's how we come to have the simple, fair, flat income tax we have today. What? Oh. Born on this day in 1935, Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez, recipient of the Medal of Honor and American hero. Benavidez is born in Cuero, Texas. His father is a Mexican farmer and his mother a Yaqui Indian. Both his parents pass away when he's a little boy, and he's raised by his aunt and uncle in El Campo. He enlists in the Texas National Guard during the Korean War, and then joins the U.S. Army and goes to jump school. He's assigned to the 82nd Airborne at Fort Bragg, and then qualifies for and is accepted into the Army Special Forces. In 1965, Benavidez is sent to Vietnam as an advisor. Soon after arriving in country, he steps on a landmine. He's paralyzed from the waist down. In the hospital back in the States, his doctors tell him he will never walk again, and they start preparing him to be discharged with permanent paralysis. But at night, when his doctors aren't around, Benavidez slides out of bed and crawls to a wall, pulling himself forward by his elbows and his chin. It's excruciatingly painful. When he reaches the wall, he sets himself up against it and backs up against the wall into a standing position. And he stands there, moving his toes back and forth, left and right. He wants to walk again. He wants to go back to Vietnam. He's motivated by all of the negative news about the U.S. presence in Vietnam. He's motivated by the injured soldiers streaming into the hospital on a regular basis with severe wounds and missing limbs. And he remembers what he learned in Special Forces training, that faith, determination, and a positive attitude will carry you further than ability. He's told, "You can do it." So he slips out of bed, crawls to the wall, every night, every chance he gets. After 9 months, when his doctor comes to discharge him and end his therapy, Benavidez musters all of his strength and fights through the pain to prove to his doctor that he will walk again. Benavidez jumps out of bed and walks out of the hospital room, much to his doctor's surprise. Right then and there, his doctor tears up the discharge paperwork and Benavidez continues his therapy. He's sent back to Fort Bragg, where he runs 5 miles a day, sometimes 10 miles a day. He does 100 push-ups a day, and by the time he does 3 training jumps in one day, he's ready to go back to Vietnam. Sergeant Roy Benavidez has been back in South Vietnam for 5 months when he volunteers for a mission on May 2nd, 1968, that he modestly refers to as 6 hours in hell. A few days earlier, he's inserted behind enemy lines with a buddy to gather intelligence. His buddy is shot and Benavidez calls for an extraction. The helicopter hovers overhead and drops 2 nylon lines. Benavidez and his buddy hook on, and they're pulled up and above the tree line. But the nylon lines get twisted together and start burning. A non-commissioned officer riding in the back of the helicopter sees the trouble, and under enemy fire, the NCO ties a rope around his own waist, climbs out of the helicopter mid-flight, and separates the lines. Benavidez and his buddy make it back to base, but the buddy dies shortly thereafter. On May 2nd, 1968, Benavidez is in the staging area of the forward operating base when he hears a call come in on the radio. A Special Forces patrol in the jungle is surrounded by the enemy and taking heavy fire. A helicopter lands carrying some of the mortally wounded. Benavidez asks the pilot, "Whose patrol is it out there?" He's told it's the NCO who saved his life the other day. Without stopping to think, Benavidez grabs a medical kit and gets on the next helicopter heading into the action. The helicopter arrives over the surrounded team, and Benavidez sees that those who are not dead are so wounded that they can't make it to the extraction point on their own. So he has the pilot move to a clearing, and he jumps from the hovering aircraft and runs to the crippled team under enemy small arms fire, taking bullets to the leg, face, and head. But Benavidez is no stranger to pain. He takes charge of the position and directs the team's fire to cover the extraction point. Under fire, and despite his wounds, he carries and drags the wounded to the waiting helicopter. He then runs alongside the helicopter, providing cover fire as it moves to pick up the remaining team members. Benavidez is shot in the stomach and takes grenade shrapnel to his back. At that same moment, the pilot is mortally wounded and the helicopter crashes. Benavidez makes his way to the wreckage and helps the wounded out of the overturned aircraft and organizes a defensive perimeter around it. He distributes water and ammunition to the tired and weak men, and he motivates them, reinstilling in them a will to live and fight. He calls in airstrikes on the growing number of enemy forces closing in on the team, in order to open a window for another extraction attempt. He continues to take hits as he tends to the wounded. He's an unstoppable force with an indomitable spirit. Finally, after another helicopter lands, Benavidez carries his fallen comrades and the wounded to the aircraft. On one of his trips to the helicopter, he's clubbed from behind by an enemy soldier. In hand-to-hand combat, he's hit in the mouth with the butt of a weapon before he kills his adversary. After that, he makes more trips to the helicopter, brings more wounded to the extraction point, and on his last trip, he gathers or destroys all the classified material he can find. Only then does he allow himself to be rescued, loaded into the helicopter, holding his guts in his hands. Back at base, he's pulled off the helicopter and laid on the ground. He's lying on the ground there, blood all over his face, his eyes stuck closed by dried blood, his jaw locked shut from that hit he takes in the mouth, his guts on the wrong side of his skin. He feels his feet being lifted up, and he can feel them being slipped inside a body bag. He hears the zipper and feels the body bag close around him tighter and tighter. Above the sound of the zipper getting closer, he hears one of his buddies yelling at the doctor, "That's Roy Benavidez." The doctor tells his buddies, "Sorry, there's nothing I can do." The zipper keeps coming closer, and the buddy insists he take one more look. The doctor stops and puts his hand on Benavidez's chest to feel for a heartbeat. Benavidez musters up all the energy he has left and does the only thing he can do. He spits in the doctor's face. Benavidez is in the hospital for another year, recovering this time from shrapnel wounds, bayonet wounds, blunt trauma, and 37 bullet wounds. Sergeant Roy Benavidez is awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on that day in 1968. At the time, there are those that think his Distinguished Service Cross should be upgraded to the Medal of Honor. But it's believed that there's no one left alive from those 6 hours in hell other than Benavidez. No living witnesses to provide an eyewitness account of his actions. But years later, it turns out there is someone. A radio man who was there on the ground that day and who Benavidez thought was dead all these years. Master Sergeant Roy P. Benavidez, born on this day in 1935, is presented the Medal of Honor by President Reagan in 1981. As his citation reads, Sergeant Benavidez's gallant choice to join voluntarily his comrades who were in critical straits, to expose himself constantly to withering enemy fire, and for his refusal to be stopped despite numerous severe wounds, saved the lives of at least 8 men. His fearless personal leadership, tenacious devotion to duty, and extremely valorous actions in the face of overwhelming odds were in keeping with the highest traditions of the military service and reflect the utmost credit on him and the United States Army. In his retirement, Master Sergeant Roy Benavidez gives motivational speeches and writes 3 books about his extraordinary life before passing away in 1998 at the age of 63. There are 148 days left in the year. On This Day is produced by me, Dave Schultz. Thank you very much for listening. I really do appreciate it. Thanks for reaching out. As always, I appreciate that too. On this day in 1884, the cornerstone for the Statue of Liberty is laid on Bedloe's Island, which is now Liberty Island in New York Harbor. So if you're still listening, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. Talk to you tomorrow.